Hey guys, it's Timothy here. This video is going to be just a little bit different than the videos I normally do. Normally I like to give advice on sets and stuff like that, but there was something that came to my attention with the last Pro Tour, that's Pro Tour Aether Revolt, that I felt like I should kind of put out there in the ether. So it's a rules interaction that I'm sure a lot of people are aware of now and a lot of people have some discrepancies with. But the reason I wanted to make a video about it and share my thoughts and opinions and what you can do to kind of mitigate the problems with it is because the same exact situation happened to me. And I'll explain what the situation is here in a second. But apparently I listen to a lot of podcasts. I watch a lot of Magic-related YouTube channels and stuff like that. A lot of people, even at the professional level, were not aware that this rule existed or that the rule was supposed to be implemented in this certain order. So let me go ahead and just kind of walk you through what happened. So the issue here has to do with the combat step of the turn, and apparently at the most recent Pro Tour there was a judge call that involved two different people. The first one, the active player, said the words, well, the active player had on board a Heart of Kiran, the vehicle, and some other creature, I think a Weldfast engineer. And their intentions were to go to combat, and during the beginning of combat step, crew their Heart of Kiran with the Weldfast engineer. Now, what happened was the active player, I'm not sure what the players' names were, sorry. The active player said combat. He was, I think, a foreign speaker. English was not his first native language. So maybe there was a little bit of discrepancy there. But the person expressed an interest to go to combat, and the opponent agreed. And then the active player supposedly thought they were in the beginning of combat step and attempted to crew their Heart of Kiran with their other creature. And this prompted a judge call from their opponent. Now, the judge ruled in favor of the opponent, saying that since the active player had expressed a desire to go to combat, that they were now locked into their declare attacker step. Even though the intentions of the active player were to just go to the beginning of combat step, not initiate attackers yet, but to crew the vehicle during the begin combat step. Now, it is an actual step of the turn. If you're a newer player, or you learn through something like Duels of the Planeswalkers or Magic Duels through one of the console games or something like that, they don't really explicitly teach you about the beginning of combat step. The combat step is boiled down to basically attackers and blockers and combat damage. So the beginning of combat step and the end combat step aren't really on the minds of newer players. Of course, this was at the Pro Tour level, so these people weren't new. But the problem here was the person who was actively playing had expressed an interest to go to combat and said something along the lines of going to combat. And the other person interpreted that as you are now declaring attackers. The official rule on this is unless you explicitly say that you are going to the beginning of combat step of your turn, you are locked into declaring attackers when you go to combat. And this exact issue happened with me. So here's how it happened with me. This was at Grand Prix Atlanta last October 2016. And I had the same exact judge call on me. This was round 8 of the day 1. It didn't cost me the game, but it was something I wasn't aware of. So here's the issue that happened with me. I'm going to move my face out of the way for a second. I had these two creatures on board, or these two objects on board. I had a Sky Skiff and I had an Aether Theorist, and I wanted to make an attack for the turn. Aether Theorist was not big enough to get through my opponent's blockers, but my opponent did not have any flying blockers, so my intentions were to attack with Sky Skiff for the turn. Now, what I could have done is I could have crewed Sky Skiff during my main phase 1, and I could have attacked with Sky Skiff, and I could have gotten a clean 2 damage in. But what I did was I said the exact words out of my mouth were combat. My opponent agreed. And then I tried to crew my Sky Skiff before attacks, and that's what prompted the judge call from my opponent. Now, when the judge came over, they asked for the situation, and I told them my intentions were to crew Sky Skiff. I said combat. My opponent agreed to combat. I am now in my beginning of combat step. I have not declared attackers yet, and the judge actually ruled in favor of my opponent, the same way the Pro Tour call worked out. And the judge explained to me that if you express the desire to go to combat, you are actually going to your declare attackers step. And that's an official judge call. Same exact call that was made at the Pro Tour, right? Now, that really baffled me, and it really upset me. I didn't complain about it. I accepted the judge call. I continued playing. But I did miss out on that damage for the turn. I was no longer able to attack with Skyskiff, and I couldn't attack with my Theorist. So I lost the damage for the turn. Now, yeah, I eventually ended up winning the game anyway, but the call was completely new to me. I've been playing Magic for about, at the time, at the GP last year, about 3.5 years. So not super long, but in 3.5 years, I have never once had a judge called on me or had anybody even question what I was doing when I said go to combat. In fact, I think most players would agree if you say the words combat, that it's implied you're not picking attackers yet, but you're going to the beginning of combat step, which is why this rule is such a problem for a lot of people. Because even at the professional level, people don't play with that intention. It is in the rules. If you express a desire to go to combat, you are declaring your attackers. That's what you did. So you have to be very clear that you are going to the beginning of combat step. And then that raises some questions too, like why even have a beginning of combat step, right? There are some times where you want to do that, though. You want to do something explicitly on the beginning of combat step that you would rather not do during your main phase, or at least you want to pass priority in a way where you give your opponent an opportunity to do something that you might react to before you declare attackers. Now, in this case, like I mentioned, I could have crewed Skyskiff during main phase 1, gone to combat, attacked with Skyskiff, right? My opponent may have reacted to me crewing Skyskiff. In the end, they didn't. Or they could have done something to Aether Theorist, or I don't know. A number of things could happen. But I don't think it's irrelevant that there is a beginning of combat step. A lot of times, it's very small percentage of the time where something matters during your beginning of combat step. But there are such things as triggers that happens. If you think of cards like Weldfast Engineer and Toolcraft Exemplar, these things trigger during your combat step. But the ruling has it in such a way that if you don't very explicitly verbally state that you are now in the beginning of combat step, you are now forced to make attackers. And that really matters to me because there are a few times, I can't really think of any examples. It is very clear with vehicles where sometimes you don't want to do something during your main phase 1 because it affords your opponent the opportunity to do something that you might then you have more information about, right? If your opponent does something during main phase 1, when you pass priority trying to go to combat, you now have a little bit more information before you declare attackers as to what cards they have in your hand. You might attack differently. If they use their removal spell during your main phase 1, you might declare completely different attackers if they're now tapped out or something like that. It is relevant. It really is. But it doesn't come up very often where there's a distinguishing or any sort of distinguishment between what you would do during your first main phase and what you would do during your beginning of combat. A lot of times it's not relevant. It's the same action. Another example is something like Pacification Array from Aether Revolt. If your opponent has one of those and you have vehicles, there's a really weird interaction where you pass priority and you see if your opponent's going to lock down an attacker or let you crew your vehicle, but then they lock down the vehicle. So I don't know. It's really awkward, but there is that beginning of combat phase that you can go to see if your opponent's going to take action. Now, there are a couple things I wanted to share with people about how you can avoid this problem, because even though I won my match at the GP, and I can't say for sure how the results of the Pro Tour match that involved this interaction worked, I do think there are times, imagine if in this same exact situation, my opponent was at 2 life and I was at 2 life. We were actually in a huge race, and I missed that damage off my Skyskiff, and I lost lethal because of that. You know, I just cost myself the game because of a rules interaction that I didn't know existed, and honestly, I think is a really bad rule to have. Just think about it. If I missed that damage and then my opponent killed me, I gave up the game because I misspoke or I wasn't clear about what I was doing. And I think that's a problem, because think about all the times you've played Magic. How many times have you actually said the words, I'm going to the combat phase, the inter-combat phase of my turn, but I'm not declaring attackers, right? You don't say that. You say combat, or you say, can I go to attackers? And if your opponent agrees, you go to whatever step you mentioned. And it's really tricky because I don't play a lot of Magic Online, but for Magic Online players or people who play primarily through MTGO, there is a beginning of combat stop on the turn that exists as part of the turn always, and it's just kind of drilled into MTGO players' minds that there are actions you can take at the beginning of combat. And I think this is a really bad rule that needs to be kind of amended, especially for newer players who don't interact in the beginning of combat phase very often. It just doesn't come up that often for a newer player. But anyway, a couple things that you guys can do to kind of avoid this same situation. It might be relevant at FNM, like this isn't going to be a problem, right? But if you go to a GP, if you go to, I don't know, a PTQ or something like that, if you're on the Pro Tour, you don't want this to happen, especially just because you weren't clear. So a couple things I wanted to mention here. The first thing you can do is just be completely intentional about what phase you are entering. If you have something you want to do on your beginning of combat step, but you're not ready to declare your attackers yet, say those words. It sounds silly, it's a mouthful, it's kind of annoying that you have to say it all, but for example, I would say, I am entering my beginning of combat phase, but not declaring attackers yet, right? It's a mouthful. It's very verbose, but it's very clear about what I'm doing. So if the judge was called on that, I could tell them, well, I told my opponent I'm going to the beginning of combat phase specifically. In addition to this, you should name what action you're trying to do on the beginning of combat phase. So if I'm trying to crew a vehicle, I might say I'm going to beginning of combat and crewing Skyskiff, all as one sentence. If I get that out there, it tells my opponent exactly what my intentions are and exactly what action I'm trying to take. Now, a lot of times people will go to the beginning of combat step as a way of just passing priority to the opponent to see if they want to interact with them, if they want to cast an instant or something like that, and that's fine. But you also want to be clear about that. So you might say, I'm going to the beginning of combat step, or would you like to do anything? Or you could just say, I'm passing priority to you. During your main phase 1, that is a perfectly fine thing to say is, I'm passing priority to you before combat. And if your opponent says, sure, I've got nothing, then you can state whether or not you're going to declare attackers or whether or not you're going to enter combat. So be very clear about what you're saying, especially at a professional level event or a competitive REL event. That way there's no confusion, there's no judge call. The second thing you should do is take actions during your main phase 1 if possible. If there's no sort of strategic benefit for you to do something during your inter-combat phase, perhaps you don't have a trigger, you don't have any vehicles to crew, you're not trying to really get around your opponent's removal spells or something like that, your opponent's tapped out, just do all the actions you need to do during your first main phase. That way you don't forget about them. And then when you're ready, go to combat and then declare your attackers. That way you don't have to worry about that extra phase in the turn that's not really adding to the turn. If your opponent's tapped out, they're not going to interact with you during that turn unless they have some weird tap ability or something like that on board. So just take whatever actions you can during main phase 1 and then just proceed from there. So that's a pretty simple rule there, right? The last one is kind of a moral rule here, and it's something I really advocate for the game, is be clear of what your opponent's trying to do. Don't try to get your opponent in trouble with the judge. Don't try to get them disqualified, or don't try to like really punk them on their turn or something like that. Clarify what your opponent's trying to do if necessary. Now, if I were in the same situation, but the misaction, whatever you want to call it, is on the other side of the table, I would try to clarify before I get a judge involved. So here's an example. What if my opponent's across from me and they go to, they say combat and I say sure, and then they try to crew Skyskiff? From a player's perspective, from a moral player's perspective, someone who's trying to enjoy the game, someone who's not trying to like cheat my opponent out of some sort of action that they're trying to take, I know for a fact my opponent's not going to declare attackers if they then try to crew their Skyskiff after declaring combat. I know that. Nobody's ignorant to think that when the opponent said combat and then tried to take an action, that they actually meant they were going to declare attackers. So don't be that person who tries to get your tries to kind of waste your opponent's time and waste their turn by calling a judge on some action that you know they weren't trying to take. And if you are really a stickler for a rule like this, clarify what your opponent is doing. If your opponent says go into combat, ask them, Are you going to beginning of combat phase, or are you going to attacker? There's nothing wrong with clarifying that, and if you verbally express that and your opponent answers, oh, well, I meant to go to beginning of combat, I'm not ready to pick attackers yet, there's no confusion, there's no problem, there's no judge that has to be called in that situation. I think it's very important practice when you're playing Magic the Gathering, or any game really, to assume that your opponent has the best intentions, right? Don't assume that your opponent's cheating. Don't assume that your opponent's trying to punk you or anything like that. Obviously, there's a difference between like trying to get your opponent with your cards and trying to get your opponent with the rules. And if they violated a rule, that's one thing, but this isn't a rule that like people are actually violating. Again, in 3.5, 4 years of playing Magic, nobody has ever stopped me except for that one moment at the GP to say, well, combat means you're going to declare attackers, right? And the whole purpose of making this video and sharing these little kind of tips, I guess, with you was that this happened at a Pro Tour. This happened at a very high stakes level tournament with very professional players. So if I was confused about the rule and professional players were confused about the rule, sorry for the voice crack, then, you know, there's some clarification that needs to be done. Now, I think the rule should be amended in a way where people can, the words that you say should express what you're doing. The word combat should initiate combat but not quite put you to attackers. The word attackers should put you in the attack step. So I don't have any fault with what the judge called at the Pro Tour. I think they were just following the rules, and that's fine for whatever judge it was. But I do think the rules need to be amended, or at least clarified. There's a lot of judge calls based on what my opponent intended. Like, yeah, when I declare blockers and my opponent says, those are your blockers, and I say, yeah, does yeah mean I'm fine to go to damage, or does yeah mean those are my blockers, I might have stuff to do, right? There's a lot of things that need to be clarified in the words that you're saying, so be specific. One more thing I wanted to share with you guys, because I have seen this come up. This is very similar to an incident I saw come up at a PTQ, my first PTQ. This was like 1.5 years ago, but it has to do with the cleanup step of the turn. Now, again, if you are in Magic the Gathering through something like Duels of the Planeswalkers, or kind of like a second party, third party kind of game, rather than Magic Online or in person with like professional people teaching you, then the cleanup step is not something you learn about right away. I didn't learn about the cleanup step until like 1.5 years into playing Magic the Gathering, right? You know you're supposed to discard at the end of turn if you have more than 7, but do a lot of people really know that there's a separate step for that? If they're newer players? I mean, obviously everybody knows now, right? But if you're a newer player, the cleanup step is not something that's explicitly taught to you very often. So what I witnessed, this didn't involve me, but it was a game going on next to me, and there was a judge call, and I thought it was a really slimy thing for one of the players to do. It was a kind of experienced or seasoned player against a newer player. You could tell the newer player had probably less than a year's worth of experience, was very new to the card interactions, and just a lot of the general rules of the game. And what the professional player did is, on his turn, he had finished attackers, he was in his second main phase, and he wanted to kind of like trick his opponent into not being able to cast something on the end of turn. So he asked his opponent, is it fine if I go to cleanup step? And he said it just like that. No emphasis on what step, no emphasis on cleanup. He's just like, can I go to cleanup step? And the opponent, being a newer player, was like, yeah, sure, that's fine. Like, probably thinking like, cleanup step, sure, whatever. And then the opponent discarded. The active player, the slimy kind of player, discarded for turn and said, go ahead. And the newer player, in response to that, said, all right, well, on the end of your turn, I'm going to try to kill your creature with this instant, like lightning strike or something like that. And the active player went, well, we're in the cleanup step. You no longer have priority to take action, so you can't do that. There was a judge call on it. And the judge ruled in favor of the active player, like he should have, because he did express the intent to go to cleanup step. If you're not aware, the cleanup step is where you discard for turn, and no player can take action during the cleanup step. There's no priority, so you can't cast instants during the cleanup step. You would have to do it at end of turn step, which is right before cleanup. And yeah, he ruled in favor of the active player, and then the newer player kind of had to take their turn and use their instant speed removal on their own turn, which, as you know, is a little bit worse. So it didn't work out in the newer player's favor. But from the perspective of the active player, what he was trying to do was he was trying to trick his opponent into not being able to do what he intended to do. That's why he said go to cleanup step. He didn't say I'm going to end my turn and then discard or anything like that. He didn't say is it fine for me to go to end of turn step. He correctly identified that his opponent was new, and he tried to punk him out of his instant speed removal spell by stating going to the cleanup step, intentionally making it so that his opponent couldn't use his instant. It's a really slimy thing to do, and I think that's very similar to what we see here with like the beginning of combat step. If I'm trying to go to combat and I say, or maybe I'm not thinking about it, maybe I'm really in the moment and I say, okay, I'm going to combat, and my opponent says sure, and then I try to like crew my vehicle, and my opponent says, well, you're in declare attackers now because you stated that you're going to combat, then I feel like I'm being punked. I don't feel like my opponent's like actually trying to make the game go in some positive manner. I feel like my opponent's just trying to get me, or trying to like get some sort of unfair advantage or some sort of unnecessary advantage out of the way I misspoke. And apparently my battery's about to die. But anyway, I wanted to share that with you guys. I'm interested to see what you guys think of it. And again, this matters to me because it did happen to me at a GP, and I have to really think about how it's going to affect me in further tournaments. But I hope this has been helpful for you, or if you weren't aware of the rules, that maybe this clarifies something for you. And if it has, I'd love to hear about that. But if you had similar experiences, or you know of anything else that kind of needs this clarification, feel free to leave a comment below so we can talk about it, because these sort of things do matter when you're at competitive level tournaments, and it really sucks when you lose a game or you fall behind in a game that you could have won because somebody wanted to call you on something that doesn't really match your intentions. But with that being said, thanks for listening to me. Thanks for hanging out for a little while. My name is Timothy, and as always, I'll see y'all next time.